This
go ahead, and
conference will
sorry
now be
about that.
recorded.
So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Please switch off your mic if you are not talking. Today with us we have Dr. Emanuele Leonardi. Emanuele is a researcher in the University of Parma in northern Italy, and is also affiliated to the Center for Social Studies, the CESH. Emanuele is a very interesting profile. He did his PhD in theory and criticism in the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and he's been very active in the academic field, but also in the social activism. So he's a very active member of the degrowth movement in Italy, and it's also a very active activist in many initiatives in Italy, especially in the left-wing departments, I would say. Last year, I was honored to read this book, his last book, that I will translate from Italy, Labor, Nature and Value, in which Emanuele tried to make a synthesis between the French philosopher André Gorz that we already encountered in some of the seminars in the past, and the movement of degrowth. So I think that's today we have the opportunity to listen to a very original scholar, and so I'm very excited to have Emanuele with us today. Okay, so the floor is yours, Emanuele. I guess that you sent me an email. I will try to, no?
Let me say I tried. I hope it worked. Okay, good.
I received it.
I'm happy.
Let's start, and then I will try to show the presentation on the screen.
Okay, so first of all, let me thank you, Mario and Andrea, for inviting me to give this seminar. The honor is all mine. I have been following Retrace work, and I truly appreciate that quite a lot. I wasn't aware that you already had a discussion about Gorz, so maybe I will run a little bit in the first part where I try to describe a little bit, about him as a public figure. Okay, so this is actually, those are the slides. Okay. And so I know it's, well, it's weird, but if you can go to the second one. Thank you so much. So it's a little bit small, but I will circulate if you want the slides afterward. So basically, well, first let me thank a lot again Mario for the very generous presentation. I don't know if I deserve all this. Sorry, I'm just trying. Okay, now it's perfect to me. So if it was for the others, that's perfect to me. Okay, good to see. So what I will try to do today is to give you some input so that we can ideally discuss collectively at the end of my presentation about 5 points relating to what Gorz wrote and did, and also what we can use of his production today to make sense of what capitalism look like in our present time, especially when it comes to its relationship with the ecological crisis. So at first, but I already said I will quickly go through that. I will give you some information about who André Gorz was. The second part I will try to define is labor-based political ecology. Like, he is widely regarded as a founding figure of political ecology. Not so much, I think, has been underlined that his political ecology is constitutively labor-based, and I try to explain why I think that. Through his analysis, I will try to frame Fordism as a mode of regulation, as an entropic device, and I'm not going to be hyper-specific here. The point is, entropic device would mean environmentally harmful. And also what I think is the most original point of his political-ecological phase, which means his interpretation of the 1973 oil shock as a double crisis of overproduction and simultaneously as of crisis of reproduction. So it's a kind of innovation of Marxist crisis theory, a remarkable one in my opinion. Fourth point, I will assess his legacy starting from a question, which is, can capitalism incorporate the ecological crisis according to André Gorz? I will review 3 different answers he gave throughout his intellectual journey and elaborate on that, then shift to the 5th point, which is I will try to argue that Gorz's work is useful today to make sense of the notion of the green economy, which in my opinion is closely related to the notion of circular economy, which is particularly relevant for your research. So, Mario, please, next slide, and please forgive me. Like, I know it sounds terrible when you see next slide, but in any case, I'm sorry for this problem of my either connection or computer or whatever. Quickly here, Gorz was, first of all, a journalist. He founded Le Nouvel Observateur, which is a very important bi-weekly, still now, in the French press scene. He has always been a public intellectual, which is one of the reasons why he so often changed his mind. Because his main problem was to be useful to the subjects he wanted to support in social struggles in France and all over Europe and the world. He was not just a French public intellectual, but a truly European public intellectual, and has been highly regarded as an heterodox Marxist. So he never restrained himself from calling himself a Marxist, but always claimed to be critical and free in appropriating what he thought was important to maintain, but also to change what he felt was was to be updated. I just want, with these 3 covers, I want to just say that, especially in France, but not only in France, Gorz's thought is undergoing a sort of renaissance. You can see André Gorz Un Vie is the biography released in 2016 by Billy Gianinazzi, Françoise Gollen, André Gorz, un philosophe de l'émancipation, shortly after followed, and it's like, not a biography, but an intellectual biography, I think we can say. Both of those 2, Gollen and Gianinazzi, put together a selection of his writing on political ecology just last year, under the title Leur Ecology et la nôtre, Their Ecology and Ours, which has been one of the most influential texts by Gorz on ecological issues. And there has been, last year, this book came out last year, and there is a significant debate, not only in France, but also in Italy, and I would say to a certain extent also in the Anglo world, starting from this book. As is usually the case with important intellectuals, we can assess their thoughts starting from a point of continuity or a point of discontinuity. In my opinion, in this case, it is more useful to follow a discontinuous path. Still, it must be remarked that Gorz himself said, like, I changed my mind many times over my life, but there is one element of continuity which I refuse to deny, which is I always been faithful to a Sartrean notion of subjectivity. Sartre has been his friend, his mentor. Gorz has been the editor of L'État moderne, which was the journal, the director historically was Jean-Paul Sartre, and the main idea is that in every individual, I'm going to simplify terribly, but just for the sake of the argument I want to make, we can discuss that more in depth later on if you want. But basically the point is there is a kernel of autonomy within each individual, which is politically necessary to defend against societal intervention, and then later on between the 70s and 80s, Gorz will use the notion of mega machine, which we can find in between lines in Ivan Illich, and let's say more openly in Jacques Ellul, and then all the trajectory, the deep root of the degrowth movement. The discontinuity instead, well, again, I'm simplifying a little, but it's consistent with what Gianninazzi also report in his biography. So there is a moment in the 50s in which Gorz is mainly interested with existentialism, then it turns to problems which are linked to classical Marxism. For example, he writes about the relationship between reform and revolution, but also shows signs of an original analysis when it comes to class composition, and when he works in close connection with other thinkers in France and in Italy about the so-called new working class, and especially the role of technicians within workplaces and within productive processes, late 60s, beginning of the 70s. Starting from a column he takes on in Le Nouvel Observateur, and then he also translates, and then he brings that, expanding it in another journal of the radical French left called Le Sauvage. He takes on, at the beginning of the 70s, an analysis of political ecology. And it's the part I will dedicate the most space today in my analysis. I don't have time to go through the following phase, 1980s, mid-90s, when he develops a critique of alienation through a critique of wage labor. He also will, supervise a few surveys in which, basically under the assumption that young people want to flee the factory regime, he will basically, let's say, propose exodus, so to speak, strategies. No? So if in the 70s is all about gaining workers' control within factories, in the 80s and 90s, he preferred to look beyond the factory gates, so to speak, and see how self-management can take place in local territories or local communes, local communities, although he would never stop trying to bridge worker struggles and local experimentations under the banner of self-management. We will talk a little bit instead about the last phase, second half of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. Then he would die, he would commit suicide with his partner in 2007, when he develops a critique of cognitive capitalism and began to be a supporter of basic income schemes, whereas in the previous phase he would claim that labor, even wage labor, though it would be desirable to shrink it, it still carries moral value because it allows people to feel connected through class ties, instead of just feeling individuals which are disconnected from one another. This is just to say that there are many ways to undertake an analysis of Gorz's thought. So what I'm trying to do is a very specific analysis, and there may be space for many, many others. So I don't claim any exhaustiveness to my work, of course. Next slide, please, Mario. Yeah, so labor-based political ecology. First slide, I define what Gorz means by political ecology. Second slide, I try to argue that it is correct to define it as labor-based. The first issue with political ecology is that Gorz starts from the premise that there is a known self-sufficiency of the ecological crisis. So even if you have data, even if you have a lot of data, that doesn't explain the foundation, the fundamental element of the ecological crisis, because that crisis is not external to society, economy, or politics, but rather represents the novel historical form those crises are assuming in the mid 70s. This argument is developed by Gorz in a very important book, 1977 in France and then 1980 the translation in English, and the title is Ecology et Liberté, where he also develops a historical materialist methodology to read this ecological crisis. Basically what he says is, since the relationship between nature and society is mediated by labor work, and I will say in a second why labor work and not just labor, not just work, then only through an analysis of what labor work looks today, we can understand why only today we have to deal with something like an ecological crisis. Because Gorz, although implicitly, he makes a clear distinction between environmental degradation, which is a dysfunctional link between society and nature, which can occur, everywhere in geography and everywhere in history. So there is this, and then there is the ecological crisis, which is the outcome of, a dysfunctional link between society and nature, which is premised on the accumulation imperative, which is a constitutive element of the capitalist mode of production. So ecological crisis is a distinctively modern and capitalist concept, whereas environmental degradation is more of an anthropological concept. And that is why I differentiated between labor and work, because again, implicitly Gorz refers to the notion of work as an anthropological category. So all societies work, all men and women work, whereas labor is the specific framing of work which is dominant in a capitalist society, which is wage labor. Okay, so those are not the same thing, because according to Gorz, not necessarily working activities drive an ecological crisis, whereas necessarily labor activities do bring us towards an ecological crisis. And I hope this I have explained that clearly. So that labor is concerned with the production of surplus value, with the production of exchange values, whereas work is concerned with the production of use values. And it can be claimed, but it's debatable, that this kind of distinction is already present in Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program in 1875. So the point for Gorz is to assess the environmental crisis from a political ecology perspective, which means individuating an historical origin, which I had just discussed, and also indicating a political solution, which in 77 Gorz sees as either eco-socialism or techno-fascism. We will come back to that, because this is one of the things that changes over Gorz's reflection over time. And finally, basically the point is, according to Gorz, the link between ecology and freedom is not at all a natural given. It is rather a political task to be assumed, carried on, cared for, and eventually, if needed, defended. Next slide, please, Mario. The reason why I believe, well, not just myself, we wrote a paper that we circulated with Maura Benegiamo, and the reason why we think it's, well, if not correct, at least plausible, to define Gorz's political ecology as labor-based, is that within his analysis, at least in the 1970s, he always keeps together environmental crisis, labor transformations, and capitalist development, and also the general framework in which Gorz poses the problem of this interlinkage is basically disclosed by May 68, which Gorz understands as the political possibility for the workers' movement to renew its action ecologically. Okay, this is what Gorz assumes as its task in the early 70s, is to give the workers' movement the tools to perceive themselves not as, let's say, agent of the growth paradigm, which we will come to in the next slide, but actually as ecological agents which can interrupt the growth paradigm or the job growth treadmill. He puts together a utopian horizon, which he calls civilization of liberated time, which actually is composed of three elements. The recognition of biophysical limits. Gorz discusses seriously the report of the Club of Rome in 1972 and actually criticizes the French Communist Party for not taking that nearly seriously enough. Actually, Marché will claim that this kind of discourses are aimed at disempowering workers and at stopping the process of democratization through consumption, which working class struggles had set in motion in the 60s. But just together with this recognition of biophysical limits comes workers' control over the productive process and self-management of local communities. For Gorz, his utopia needs to keep together these three elements. And there is an implication, well, there are various implications for the politics of unions, but most notably what Gorz suggests is that there should be a shift from quantitative demands, which are focused on the distribution of value and so tends to be wage-related demands, to the qualitative composition of production. Okay, so basically his proposal is, well, we still keep fighting for better wages and less working time, but more and more we should be struggling to have a say in what we produce, when, where, when, by whom. This is his point already in 1971 in an address to the IG Metall metal worker union in Germany. Next one, please, Mario. So basically, the hope Gorz put forward never really materialized, okay? But it is also true that some parts of some unions actually took that suggestion seriously. There were, in Italy, in France, in Germany, instances of working class environmentalism which actually followed Gorz's thought process, and they should be, in my opinion, recuperated. So part of my recent research is precisely dedicated to a sort of mapping of this situation, especially in Italy, and a sort of rediscovery, because I do think that climate justice / just transition today needs to establish a link with those examples in the past. But it is true that when Gorz discusses about those this cycle of mobilization in the late 60s, the beginning of the 70s, is, in my opinion, lucid to basically say that actually the workers' movement, for the most part, followed this idea of expanding production, which which was predicated on this idea that Matthias Schmelzer described very well in a book released in 2015 entitled The Hegemony of Growth, and he described this growth paradigm as a strategy to displace social antagonism from the primary distribution of surplus value to basically the idea of producing more so that everybody, at least in the productive sector, in the sphere of production, could have a little bit more than before. And Gorz shows very well, in my opinion, that this growth paradigm, which is the political pillar of the Fordist regime of regulation, should be regarded as an entropic device. Again, entropic device is not his concept, I believe, though that it describes what he says nicely, so I proposed it. And the idea is, in order to have the growth paradigm which accounts for the deal between working classes and capitalist investors within the sphere of production, you also have some losers, which traditionally have been the subjects of the sphere of reproduction. So basically, domestic labor, which is unpaid and mostly performed by women, slave labor, mostly linked to colonization processes, and of course, environmental activity, the so-called free gifts of nature. This is why, the impact on on the environment has been remarkable, and there are right now, in the last 10 years, a few historians, not only in France and Italy, but also elsewhere, who are working precisely to evaluate the environmental impact of the so-called glorious 30 years, the Trente Glorieuses, according to French historians, so the post-Second World War period, 1945-1975. Another way of putting together the same concept is the idea by Klaus Hofe of the productivist nexus, which links full employment to GDP growth. And again, so although the cycle of mobilization, late 60s, beginning of the 70s, showed the potential to interlink quantitative demands with qualitative demands, what we had instead, especially from the second half of the 1970s onwards, was a preeminence of quantitative demands over qualitative demands, which eventually forced unions on the defensive end. And now we have a situation in which the job blackmail, so the idea that either you have a safe workplace or you have or you don't have your job, so job versus health trade-off. This is now an everyday experience for many workers. It wasn't the case back in the 60s and the 70s, because actually it was through worker struggles that the ecological potential of democratic politics emerged in the first place. Next slide, please, Mario. Thank you. So, and all this has been, not the previous one, sorry, Mario. Yes, here we go. And this is an important one because basically all this analytical framework is embedded within one particular proposal made up by Gorz, which is an interpretation of the oil shock of 1973 as a double crisis. So Gorz agrees with many Marxist commentators that we are witnessing at the time an overaccumulation crisis, which is tied to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which, again, I'm simplifying unacceptably, but we can go in details later on if you want. The idea is that by substituting living labor with machinery over the long run, you are reducing the surplus value production, because the only element which actually produces surplus value is living labor within the productive process managed by capitalist investors. But also, but Gorz, he agrees that that crisis is an overaccumulation crisis, but also sees that crisis for the first time as something he calls a crisis of reproduction, which is basically this idea, like Either you preserve the environment at the beginning of the productive process by not using certain elements which are polluting, or you need to clean up it afterwards, and he discusses different cases. For example, in some steel sectors, the first option occurred in Germany, whereas in the chemical sector, the second option occurred. But whether the two, regardless of which one single sectors decided to go for, what they experienced was the ecological crisis as a pure cost. So in order to maintain the same levels of production, they had to spend more money, either ex ante or ex post, which translated into higher prices, which then translated into a lower rate of profit over the medium and long term. This is, well, first of all, it is consistent with what later on, a decade later, James O'Connor would call the second contradiction of capitalism. So there is a collective of people who are working around that kind of problem between the 70s and the 80s. But what is interesting to me is that this way of framing the issue means that, according to Gorz and others, it is simply impossible at that stage, mid-70s, to think about an ecological accumulation strategy on the part of capital. Okay? Capitalist elites have two options at the time. Either they sell their products at a higher price, and so they reduce their profit margins, or they pretend the ecological crisis does not exist. Okay, which is the reason why the first instances of environmental policy are all structured around the frame of command and control. So you are given a limit, and if you don't respect the limit, you pay. Okay? What we will see starting from the late 80s is a different strategy, which is a market integration strategy of ecological issues within trade strategies and commercial strategies. Next slide, please, Mario. So I am starting to evaluate, so to speak, Gorz's legacy, because we will see that he will change his mind later on, and we can make sense of this change of mind through a very simple question, which is, can capitalism incorporate the ecological crisis within value practices, value circuits, according to Gorz? So there is a first visionary moment, okay, in 1972, when Gorz, as editor of Le Nouvel Observateur, hosts a very interesting debate about the limits to growth report with Sico Mansell, for example, which was a bureaucrat, like, a high-profile bureaucrat of the European community back in the day, which actually endorsed the Club of Rome report. And while during that debate, Gorz would coin the term degrowth, although he would not expand or elaborate on that, but it's true that he talks about that. But more interestingly, from my perspective, he actually, at a certain point, would say, actually, capitalism can subsume nature within its circuits of value, and would conclude his line of reasoning by saying, quote, even air will become a commodity. And if you think you substitute air with atmosphere, or you want to, expand the meaning of air, but if you consider carbon trading, that's precisely what have happened. However, other than this visionary moment in 1972, in 1977, Gorz would align with the conventional wisdom both on the right, on the left, and on the center in the mid-70s, which is the question has a clear answer, which is no. Okay, capitalism cannot deal with the ecological crisis because they don't want to see their rate of profit decline, so they will act indifferently. Okay, acting indifferently, they will exacerbate the problem, and they will then face a catastrophic situation. Back in the day, the green version of the breakdown theory was quite widespread. And so basically, Gorz would say either we will have techno-fascism if we lose, or if we win, we will have eco-fascism. And I wanted to put clearly that in this book, in Ecology et Liberté, it doesn't say the alternative is eco-socialism or fascism, is conviviality or techno-fascism, which combined with what he would say a little before and a little later, means that he would see conviviality as a fundamental element of a socialist transition. I'm saying that because I know that Mario Pansera and Andrea Genovese have worked extensively on the notion of convivial technology. And I think Gorz may be useful, well, as they obviously know very well. But to conclude about this slide, the point is, in this phase, in 1977, Gorz actually agrees with the conventional wisdom, which in my opinion was actually the truth, that from a theoretical perspective, capitalism sees nature as a limit to valorization, but a very peculiar limit, a limit which is a provider of raw materials at the beginning of the economic process and capacity for disposal at the end, the famous is tap and sink, which in the words of Ricardo needs to be infinite and free. Okay, nature provides infinitely and gratuitously. David Ricardo would say, and so there is a clear trade-off between infinite growth and physical limits. Next one, please, Mario. Mario, do I have a? It doesn't take. It wouldn't take. I don't think it takes that long to go to the conclusion. But should I run, or do I have 10 minutes? Just tell me because I lost track.
Normally we have like 40-45 minutes of presentation.
No, go on.
I can go on regular, like, you know. Okay, perfect. That's okay. So what happens is that, as we saw, for a long period, Gorz, well, I mean, he keeps interest, like, you know, he's still interested in ecological issues, but those do not represent the main focus of his reflection. This is not the case in the last 2 years of his production, especially in connection with the journal Ecorev, which is still published today, and which is one of the main hub of this of the Gorz Renaissance I referred to before. For example, in the last issue, there is a very nice article titled "Les Gilets jaunes et mouvement Gorzien." So it's a Gorzian reading of the Yellow Vests movement in France. Well, in 2005, in an interview, basically Gorz is faced again with the question, can capitalism incorporate the ecological crisis? Basically says, yes, but no. So the ecological crisis is manageable because we are in a knowledge-based society, but such management would require knowledge not to be a commodity. So the very reason why capitalism can manage the ecological crisis is the reason that makes capitalism unable to manage the ecological crisis. So basically, Gorz, which is in a period of absolute optimism, like, you know, it's before the great crisis of 2007, 2008, and is basically, like, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Mason books, But in those periods, God seems to be very aligned with this interpretation. No? So basically, capitalism is self-destructing, basically, and people can autonomously experiment with new technology which consume much less material, and by doing so, they will sever the ties they have with the capitalist system and create free islands of autonomous living. So he is very optimistic, but what is interesting to me is to question why he changes his mind. And I think he does that because he realizes that just beside uh, the value-nature nexus, which I just described and which I defined before, classical, just because it originates from classical political economy, it emerged in between the 80s and the 90s, basically a new value-nature nexus, and I want to be clear about that. It's not a substitution. It's basically a bifurcation. So we have still the classical value-nature nexus, but also in some sectors a new value-nature nexus in which nature doesn't play the role of a border to valorization, a border which is infinite and free, but rather enters the circuits of valorization. We will see how very quickly, but the point is that this wager, okay, the idea that the ecological crisis is not a barrier to valorization, but can be a driver of capital accumulation, is the political wager which sustains climate governance, biodiversity governance at the UN level. Without that, you don't have those systems. So you don't have Kyoto, you don't have the Paris Agreement, regardless of their success or not. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying that there is a conceptual innovation which is grounded in material practices, which is like, the peculiar defeat of the cycle of mobilization of the 60s and the 70s. But there is, right now, differently from the mid-70s, capitalism is able to at least propose conceptually an accumulation strategy based on solving the ecological crisis. And the first, in my opinion, to see that with clarity was Sergio Bologna, who is a workers' movement historian, an Italian one, but he worked most of his career in Germany and elsewhere. And in an article for the journal Primo Maggio in 1987, he clearly states capital needs environmentalism for a new industrial revolution, not just about process innovation, but about product innovation. And I want to stress this because already in 1987, Bologna realized that the point of the true novelty or the true originality of the green economy, the circular economy, bioeconomy, is not really linked to efficiency gains. Okay, it is linked to their supposed capacity to open up a new space for accumulation. Okay, so basically it's a Schumpeterian reading of the green economy. Okay, it's not just that you gain in efficiency, is that you open up a new space which was impossible to see before, and which can actually keep together environmental preservation and capital accumulation. Next slide, please, Mario, and you'll get a beer for this work I'm asking you to do. So thanks. This shift, okay, had an inceptive phase in with the notion of sustainable development, which actually in its if we distill the book Our Common Future, the point is if we act attentively, we can keep growth and ecological preservation together, but just because growth, pro-growthers would agree to grow a little bit less, and environmentalists would agree to be a little less radical. Okay, this is basically what sustainable development is about, at least in my opinion. The green economy is a radicalization of this discourse, so a shift from a crisis of capitalism to a crisis for capitalism. And there are, of course, conditions of possibility for this shift to happen, and I think that at least three must be mentioned. The first is that the sphere of social reproduction, which traditionally had been supposed to be unproductive, okay, through struggles pose its subjective presence. So think about militant feminism, think about proto-environmentalism, but also, in my case, given what I study, but also here, please refer to the works by Stefania Barca, workers' environmentalism itself had posed the need to think liberation from work in connection with liberation of the sphere of social reproduction. So this is a first condition of possibility. The second condition of possibility, in my opinion, is the process of financialization. And so you will see that all green markets which have been operational so far, and so especially carbon trading and payment for ecosystem services schemes, actually are structured as if they were financial markets, and when they were not structured as such, they simply didn't work. The first period of the ETS, the EU ETS, is instructive in this regard, a little bit because of grandfathering, but also because without being able to exchange excessive allowances in excess for derivatives, there was simply no point for companies to accumulate those allowances. And then the fact that, in Gorz, it would be knowledge-based society, cognitive capitalism. Right now, we know that we should rather talk about digital capitalism. So again, coming back to Gorz's optimism about the knowledge-based society, right now we know that all that potential of the so-called general intellect did not bring us to a civilization of liberated time, but rather brought us to platform capitalism. So clearly, there was no immunity in knowledge production towards commodification. But yeah, so my main point is that it's precisely because labor practices change that we can think something about a green economy strategy, which shows a constitutive ambiguity, which we already saw. Basically, it could work if liberated from the profit imperative, but as far as it becomes tied to the profit imperative, it is bound to produce a sort of a short circuit between the ecological ends. Now, basically, those markets have been created to tackle ecological issues and their monetary means. Okay, this is why, especially when it comes to carbon trading, I think it's, if not wrong, at least problematic to say that they haven't worked, because they have created value and they have proved, well, less than expected, but some companies, and well, ironically, especially big polluters, have benefited from those markets. So economically, they have been so-so. Partly they have worked. It is ecologically that they haven't worked so far. Next slide, please. And we are basically at the end. So basically, the reason why I have proposed, well, I have worked on Gorz, and I thought my research could give you some interesting and maybe useful inputs for your research, is that I think that Gorz is useful for three main reasons when it comes to thinking our present. First, it helps us in analyzing the articulation between the classical value-nature nexus and the new one in contemporary capitalism, and we have plenty of opportunities. It can be sector by sector, market by market, actor by actor. But I think it would be useful to keep in mind that the lenses with which ecologists, but also eco-Marxists criticized capitalism in the 70s and 80s are not necessarily well equipped if they are left only by themselves to understand what's happening today. It is useful because it allows us to rediscover a sort of a labor-based genealogy of the question concerning the environment. So Gorz particularly devoted attention to the leaf factory occupation in 1973 in France. It was a long-lasting occupation. All over Western Europe, there were analyses of this struggle, and they have been largely forgotten. I think that climate justice today, degrowth today, eco-Marxism today should start to rediscover those inceptive moments, because they clearly have been defeated, but they have shown that the relationship between labor and ecology can be one of mutual reinforcement rather than one of mutual exclusion. And also, and finally, I think it's useful to think about the fundamental ambivalence of green economy, circular economy, and bioeconomy, which I just described, so I'm not going to repeat what I just said. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope it made some sense, and thanks again.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you a lot, Emanuele. I think this was very dense, intellectually speaking, presentation. So I suggest everybody to make their question in the chats, and then I will try to moderate. I have a first question for you, which is I think quite general, but it's linked to my my intellectual interest and my research agenda. And you know that I have this new project that is just started on innovation in the post-growth world. In terms of action, I think that the work of Gorz is fascinating because it's on one hand is very it's dense from a conceptual perspective, but it also very much attached to action. He used to have a very strong links with unions movements in Italy, for example. He was very good friends of some of the best and important person in the union, in Italian union movements. So my question for you is that how do you envision experience like the Lucas plan, for example, in the 70s? We had this presentation 1 month ago about my new project, in which I mentioned the Lucas plan as an experiment of struggle, but also an experiment in which workers take the initiative to say, okay, we want to decide what to produce and what is just to produce, what is fair to be produced. We want to take, we want to have a voice in the decision making, so in this tradition, how do you envision the action, not only the academic work, but the action in cases like, for example, the case of Taranto, that we are going to work together in the Just to See project, for example, or the recent case of Civitavecchia thermal central, or here in Galicia, we have the case of Alcoa, which is a former coal mine and factory and steel factory as well. So it's really possible to go there and start a conversation with workers that are not like working in a very small kind of, fab labs or makers community or digital technology, small start agile company or startups, but big traditionally factories, and start a conversation with the unions and with the worker and say, okay, we need another model, and these are the intellectual tools that we can offer. What do you think?
Tell me, should I reply to your question and wait? Yes?
I mean, you can start replying my question.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking how you are
Otherwise,
used to.
just give me your opinion. Then in the meantime,
Yeah,
I will
yeah. No, I agree, and that's. I mean, it's a key question. So I just want to. I don't want to take it too long. But the point is, one of the reasons, in my opinion, that cycle of mobilization 68 73, okay, let's say, like, from the very beginning, which they gained forces, because another thing to discover is that in France 68 was mainly a worker movement, in Italy 69 was mainly a worker movement. So, like, the social force of those movements weren't just student or civil society, were first and foremost workers movement. I think that one of the reasons why they eventually were defeated, I'm not claiming the most important, I don't know, but one of the reasons why is that they accepted a sort of division of labor, so that, like, Marxist inclined or workerist, okay, intellectuals, but also militants, they were dealing with the so-called internal contradiction of capital. So they would look at the crisis through the lenses of overproduction, and the others, proto-ecologists, feminists, and others, they would look at the crisis of reproduction, just because socially the tide was raising, okay? And so, how can I say, the convergence was basically brought about by inertia, okay? There was social mobilization, so you didn't need to theorize a little bit about organization. Why I'm saying this, and I think it's relevant to replying to your question. Because if we keep, as it is the case for sure in Taranto, okay, I don't know if other people are familiar with the Taranto situation, so the biggest steel plant in Europe, in which there is a big divide between official unions and local communities, okay? What they look at is that they start their organizing assuming that labor and health are on opposite sides, okay? Which is, like, the point is both sides want to evangelize the others, okay? So the main issue in their discursive activity is, I am speaking the truth, you are not speaking the truth. This is terrible from an organizing perspective. Terrible, because it basically burns bridges before engaging in a discussion. To do what you suggest, and which is exactly what happened in Civitavecchia now, and what happened in Porto Marghera in the 70s, or in Turin, in some of the most polluting parts of the Mirafiori factory at Fiat. You start from the legitimate needs of people working there, okay? And the work of organization is basically to frame their demands, okay, in terms which incorporate ecological concerns, okay? The climate justice movement in Italy right now is precisely trying to do that. I give you an example which is not industrial. Well, it is industrial, and it is linked to the pandemic to give you, I hope it clarifies a little what I want to say, okay? We know that there are ecological roots to the pandemic we are experiencing now, okay? At least it's, in my opinion, right now, well accepted within the scientific community. And I would say, at least the struggles I participated within the pandemic conjuncture, all the sectors, from the workers who actually went on strike to ask more personal protection, longer breaks, like, a lot of demands were very bread and butter, okay, but they could imply the fact that you need to refuse just in time in terms of organizing the production, and very long value chains in terms of transportation of commodity. Okay, you just need the right lenses to read those struggles from a climate justice or environmental justice perspective. Okay, and then you start to organize in those ways. For example, here in my city right now, we are involved in a workers' inquiry about the meat sector. Okay, in Germany, 2 months ago, given a series of strikes, a law had been passed which basically forbids subcontracting in the meat sector. Forbidding subcontracting means longer breaks, better conditions, and basically increases workers' power in demand. Basically, what they were demanding in between the lines was a slowing down of the productive process. Okay, in front of this situation, climate justice, environmental justice, or even animal liberation activists have a choice. They can try to engage with this struggle as supporters, trying to basically build, okay, their own frames within those occurring struggle, or they can assume that since these workers are not demanding for the dismantling of the meat sector, then they are enemies, so to speak.
Okay.
You see what I meant before, like, if you have the right genealogy and you start from workers' demands, and then from there you try to basically work on developing those along what we consider the right lines, then you have an opportunity. Instead, if you basically say asking for that is not enough, you need to be more radical, which in practical terms means you need to be unemployed. Because for someone working in the meat sector, demanding the end of the meat sector means demanding to be unemployed. Okay.
Okay.
So sorry, I went long, but
tactical dialogue. It's a tactical dialogue. Okay. So I would like to open the discussion. I invite the women participating in the workshop to be a little bit more active. So here I will skip Akis and Andrea in the line. I will give room to Sofia. And then we will be back to Andrea and Akis, just to, because otherwise only white male talking.
Hi, thank you. I study architecture and urban planning, and it's my understanding that Gorz emphasized communal living and hated roads and cars, which prevented.
could you please slow down a little, because sorry, my fault, of course, but if you can.
It's my understanding that Gorz emphasized communal forms of living and hated roads and cars, which prevented communities from forming. Could you tell me if he was involved in any urban planning activism or schemes, or if he came up with a city plan to match his ideas about social organization?
As before, so question and reply. Thanks. Yes, it was, well, depending on the phases of his production, but in any case, it was very much involved in communal forms of living. Already in the 70s, he had an article which is, well, something like against the car, but using a word for car which was basically derogatory. Okay, where he imagined how a city could live, could function without, like, with a network of transportation not based on private mobility. So, and at the end of Ecology et Liberté, there is, like, this part which is which he titles Possible Utopia, and part of the program is precisely not to, like, basically relocalizing every social but also manufacturing activity in small zones within the city, so that you can move, but just through collective transportation. Probably more importantly, though, I would say that given to the fact that basically his wife got sick for a degenerative disease, but like the story is long, because basically it's one of those disease linked to development. Okay, so basically she was contaminated, but then she developed a sensitivity, a profound sensitivity to vibrations. So they had to move far from Paris, like, basically in an open countryside, where, like, he retired very early and stuff like that. And basically, I think that more than texts in which he discusses urban planning or other than those I mentioned, you can see a constant presence of those kind of concerns in all his writings, just because, like, he keeps referring to the fact that his thought process is due to the fact that he's no longer living a urban life. Okay, and all the letters, all the interviews, people, like, he wouldn't give interviews at the phone, so people who wanted to interview him had to go to Bono and sit in their garden, drink tea, and, like, basically go through the fact that he had chosen a country life style of living. But yeah, other than that, I even in the last interviews, there are a couple of mentioning of these um, projects, but always, like, at least to my knowledge, yeah, well, I have studied Gorz extensively, but you never know. Like, there are the archives at the IMEC are full of stuff which is still waiting for unpacking. But to my knowledge, at least, when he talks about communal projects at the end of his life, which is the part I know better, it's always to show that basically the free software movement and the back to the lenders go, like, need to go hand in hand. Okay, so, like, it talks about eco villages using advanced technologies. It talks about fabbers living in the countryside, and so, like, basically being interested in ecology and stuff like that. I hope I gave you some
Yeah.
inputs.
I think that was also an interesting mention to the Ivan Illich work about the perfect size of the city. No, the idea that Ivan Illich say that the perfect size of the city is a city in which you can move everywhere in 20 minutes for walking or 10 minutes biking. And then in the book Ecology as Politics, Gorz talk about this communal workshop that's basically in any neighborhoods. We should have a communal workshop in which we go there and plan our technology and do whatever we want. So I really see this as a urban project. And in Barcelona, actually, there are many activity like that, like initiative that try to simulate this, no, like bike shed workshop or play Fab Labs, for example, are some sort of like resonates with this idea of having something in the urban space in which everybody can go and plan and design technology. Okay.
Yeah.
Akis. I don't know if Sophia wants to you want to reply or
No, thank
reply.
you. I was just interested. So you said he wasn't in dialogue with any planners in the 80s at all?
With
Or
any?
planners in the 80s? Was this
Planners.
further?
No, I don't know. I think actually, well, it must have been, because the piece on the car, like, when it is quite detailed in like, in the suggestions he makes. So I would assume he was knowledgeable about that. So, like, yeah, I would assume. I don't know of open references or mentioning of urban planners. That much I don't recall, but there may be in the text. I have worked extensively on Gorz, but always with, like, you have an hypothesis, and when you read selectively. So it's totally probable that I missed some references, so I wouldn't be too sharp in saying no, that there's no references. Maybe there are, and I would assume in any case he was knowledgeable about that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Akis and then Andrea. We can do like
Thank you. Shall I?
go on.
Okay. So thank you again for your presentation. I have a very, 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 very general question, and I hope that you can help me Are there any works, published papers or books that connect Gorz with Adorno? Especially I'm referring to Adorno's culture industry. Thank you.
Andrea, do you want to? Let's
Okay.
collect a couple of questions and you will answer.
But no, I think he can, Emanuele can go, and then I can ask the question.
Okay. It's a very interesting question. So I am not aware of any work devoted to this relationship, but Gorz deals quite a lot with the tradition of critical theory. In his book 1988, which I don't recall in English, but it has been translated. So if you give me, but in any case, in French, the book comes out in 1988. It's basically about alienation, how work brings alienation. I don't recall him quoting Adorno directly, but actually it may be. So have a look to that. When it comes though to the Frankfurt School, he had a very close relationship with Marcuse. Okay, and I think that the reason why he connected much better with Marcuse than with Adorno, other than anagraphical reasons, like Marcuse was his, well, it was his, they were friends. Like, you know, when Marcuse would travel to Europe, would go to Gorz, and when Gorz would travel to California, would go at Marcuse's. Is that Gorz, especially in up until the mid 80s, Gorz has never been a pessimist. Back in the day, like, you know, the Frankfurt School wasn't something you could maybe study in academia and then forget when you go out and are a militant or something like that. And especially after 68, like, you know, the mid 70s, the wave started to go down. The idea was, if you refer to the Frankfurt School, then you somehow imply that there's no way out of this mega machine. With one exception, which was Marcuse. I'm not claiming that was a correct reading. I'm just saying that if you read the biography, this is more or less what emerges about also Gorz and the Frankfurt School. Whereas in Marcuse, which is always so ambivalent, because Marcuse is actually in many books, the one-dimensional man is very weird, because basically it has become a banner book for an incredibly lively movement, while claiming that there was no way out to the cultural industry. So within this general ambivalent, I think that the influence of the of Frankfurt School onto Gorz has been particularly relevant up until the 80s. Although I would also claim that it isn't that much the case when it comes to political ecology. So I do believe that the kind of analysis you can do about ecological issues, starting from dialectic of the Enlightenment, is completely different than the kind of analysis you do if you start from the workplace, from union politics, and from the grassroots, let's say. Again, we can debate about that. So it's not that I have a fully shaped opinion on that, but it is an impression I want to share with you. If you actually work on that direction, please keep me posted, because I am interested in that.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. Thank you.
Andrea?
Okay, thank you, Emanuele, for your excellent talk. I remember one of the most relevant takeaways for me when I read André Gorz Ecology as Politics book was when, and Mario has mentioned this earlier, he envisaged a society in which we could have a combination of central planning and workers self-management. So the central planning element for the basic needs to be collectively decided, self-management to express within certain limits workers' creativity. I remember, like Mario said, this page where he talked about community workshops, where you could go get the materials, the equipment, and you can just produce the things you wanted according to your own creativity, of course, within the limits of the materials and of the equipment you were given. I think, in my opinion, this was probably one of the best contributions from André Gorz, because it was a very genuine attempt to combine the best from different strands of the socialist tradition, the central planning, self-management, combining them in a way they could work. Do you think this difficult but stimulating synthesis could be the response to the challenges we have in front of us, or can at least be, something that can be at the root of a political proposal for socialism in the 21st century?
So, spoiler, yes, but with a few cautions. First, that article in Ecology is Politics is to be considered like within an ecosystem of short writings from 73 to basically the last, the first appendix of the book 1980, which is called tellingly Farewell to the Working Class. But then there has been a polemic because the subtitle is After Socialism, so basically when he was accused to have abandoned Marxism or communism, he said, no, to be honest, after socialism, that's communism. So like he was, I think, within a problematic environment in which he didn't accept to abandon completely his traditions. So Marxism included also really actually existing socialist projects, but also wanted to tap into the 68 movement. So there are moments like the article you mentioned in which is more in between and more balanced, and I do prefer that. But if I had to be honest, I think that the general attitude of that period is the one shown in Ecology et Liberté, when it basically says self-management is an alternative both to market relations, which are dominating through commodification, and state apparatuses, which are dominating through bureaucratization. I'm saying this because I do believe that it's basically the same answer I gave to Mario, but translated it onto a different debate. I do believe it is important to go back to the debate about central planning they had in the 70s, and to be completely honest with you, since central planning is not originally an ecological issue, probably it would be better to go back to 20s, like the Soviet debate on central planning, because then you have those like Lange, and they thought they had outwitted Mises, and then Hayek comes back, but then of course Hayek wins the debate, but at the same time had to admit that what he calls the invisible hand is a form of planning, because you have the banks at the beginning, so they decide where to invest. So if we go through that and we take into account that there were reasons why in the 70s planning was criticized, and I think they were understandable reasons at the very least, then if we pose correctly the problem of planning today, I do believe there's no way out. It has to be, and I would say that as a very preliminary thought, because we need to go on with the debate, which is not a very widespread debate, because I can recall in the last year Andreas Malm book on climate change, which is very, very direct on this, with some good points about planning and some very, I don't know, some problems it solves so quickly. I don't think are solvable so quickly, let's say. Then there's a Razmik Ucheyan book on artificial needs, and the last chapter is, in my opinion, very, very important to keep in mind. And we have in Italy Emiliano Brancaccio, but not just in Italy. His work is, and I think it is necessary to enter this kind of debate, keeping in mind that we have, within climate justice, within environmental justice, an experience of social movements which, I don't know, I would see the division of labor between planning and self-management today in a way in which self-management social movements design the horizon and planning puts in place the means, okay, which is basically the opposite that market planning has done in the relationship between economy and ecology, in which the ecology was supposed to give the horizon, but it didn't. I'm not super optimistic that this can happen, but I don't see any other viable option. By the way, in my opinion, and there are people who keep saying this, that the self-management way Gorz framed the issue, like he preferred self-management, in the 70s should be reproposed. Well, in the 21st century, I don't see any reason. So it's beyond my comprehension that, although of course it's a problem, right? If one wants to believe that. But I think we need to go back to talk about planning.
Yeah, just a follow up to your response, if I can, Mario. Yeah, okay. I mean, because many of the problems related to planning in the 20th century were also due to the lack of technology, the lack of computing power to solve planning problems. I think, if you think about Kantorovich, for instance, okay, he had problems in solving a linear programming problem, which you can easily do that with Excel today. I think, an important thing to recognize today is that it's not that planning doesn't exist anymore, because I think, we have the likes of Amazon, which to me are planning much more than there was planning in the Soviet Union, because every time you go to their website and just surf a few products, just because you have been visiting that web page, even if you didn't buy anything, they'll move that product closer to you in a distribution center which is closer to you. They update prices 30 times per day on their products based on forecast demand. So yeah, I completely agree with you on the fact that we need to have a sort of reappropriation process of the word planning, because I think, these days we have multinational corporations which are planning like they've never been doing that in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I was trying to comment on this. I think that today we are facing two different conditions that were completely different in the 20s during the Soviet Union. The idea of technology that Andrea already mentioned, the fact that now with digital technology we can have much more powerful tools for planning. And the second point, I think, is scale. That we are too much attached to this idea of the Soviet Union as a monster machine of central planning, but actually planning can occur at different levels. You can also have like a planning strategy at the neighborhood level, or at the city level or small town level. So I think there is like a little bit of a stigma, of this central planning discourse, that we're scared of central planning because it's a communist strategy, and we all know that didn't work and it was oppressive and stuff like that. So I think maybe there is a space for a reappropriation of language. I think there is Melina, I don't, is that she's saying something like very interesting in your presentation, but probably she left. And then Tommaso.
Yes.
So we will not hear the voice of our female ESRs today, unfortunately. I mean, I cannot force you to speak. Tommaso,
Yeah,
go.
I can try, but not sure of the result. Yeah, my question is about the solutions towards the ecological crisis, but by like modern world economies. And it is how would, in your opinion, Gorz describe those, like more towards eco-socialism or more towards techno-fascism, or inside using other categories to describe them?
Sorry, you said modern economists?
The
Sorry,
modern economies, modern nations and institutions.
so modern in sense the contemporary after
Contemporary,
yeah,
yeah.
no, I'm just asking, no worries, like, you know, just wanted to make sure to understand. In my opinion, but again, this is, you know, completely debatable because it's just an opinion, right? So, like, you know, I think he recognized that there was a shift, and so it was possible to think about an accumulation strategy based on ecological crisis, but thought that the fact that, you know, for example, in Kyoto, they started to walk that path would have automatically led to a situation in which the capitalist system would have been emptied automatically, basically by itself. So at least is my idea. So I think in the end, he wouldn't have, well, for sure, he wouldn't have described any situation of the contemporary world as eco-socialism. Maybe Cuba was a big admirer of the Cuban Revolution, and up until the 90s spoke highly about that. But clearly we are not seeing a specific policy set aimed at those kind of problems, even for geographical reasons. I mean, if you live in a flatland, the huge flatland, you have some problems which are kind of difficult to deal with, and if you live in a small and windy island, it's a bit better. Like, you know, the problems they have is more linked to climate change, and Cuba doesn't contribute that much. So it's not. And also, I think he wouldn't describe as techno-fascism France, the European Union, or the American. Or maybe the last administration in the US, that could be. I wouldn't know, but let's say I'm pretty sure that he would have rephrased. You know, if someone interviewing him would have asked, "Do you still maintain that it is either eco-socialism or eco-fascist?" Probably he would have said no. But that's my idea.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. Thank you all for the questions. It's a pleasure.
Okay, I'm not receiving any other question. I just want to tell everybody that Emanuele will participate with me and Andrea in our new H2 2020 project on circular economy that we were awarded in December last year. That is called Just Transition to Circular Economy, in which we are going to understand what are the geopolitics dimension, including, you know, global environmental justice, gender dimension, labor, in this supposed transition that we are making toward the circular economy. And Emanuele is going to participate with Stefania Barca, that he mentioned during the presentation, as a member of the chess in Coimbra. I mean, this this is going to be a 3 years project. I think it's very exciting because it will include a number of African partners. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this this idea of a circular economy, from technology to the to all the implication that they have this transition for class relationship, for example, from relations between North and South. So for me, it's a very exciting project, and we're very happy to have Emanuele with us in the projects. If there is more, sorry?
I'm happy too, for the record.
Yes. If there is no other question, I don't know. We will upload as usual the video online in our channels. And if you are okay, I will circulate the few slides that you send us among the ESRs. And nothing. Have a nice Easter time.
Thank you very much, Mario and Andrea. Thank you for the students for listening. It's always a pleasure to know someone is listening. So thanks, and well, talk soon.
Okay. Bye bye. Ciao.